The Americanization of the Vietnam War began in 1965 and lasted until 1969. It began under the administration of Lyndon Johnson, though it probably would have been accelerated at least to some extent if Kennedy had lived and had been elected to a second term. The domino theory was fairly prominent. The muscular anti-communism of the Kennedys was enough that it's conceivable that Kennedy would have done things similar to Johnson, but much of the actual activity is Johnson related because Johnson had a particular view of the world and a particular way of doing things that was a lot more ham-handed than Kennedy would have brought himself to do. Kennedy dithered quite a bit. Johnson went ahead and made decisions for right or wrong, and that in and of itself can be fairly problematic. But let's look at how Johnson escalated the war in Vietnam to a full-scale war being run by the Americans. This is outside of that concept of the Cold War being fought by proxy war, although the Americans were bearing the brunt of the Vietnam War. The Chinese and the Russians were not. They were supplying the Viet Cong, which was an indigenous guerrilla anti-American nationalist / communist group in South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese army, which at this distance is sometimes a little bit difficult to separate. But remember, there were two opponents in Vietnam. They were not the same opponent. There were North Vietnamese army regulars invading the South, and there was a guerrilla conglomeration called the Viet Cong, and they are two distinct organizations. Well, this war escalated beginning in 1964 when Johnson appeared to have been looking for a sign to tell him what to do in Vietnam. And that's not to say that he was just pondering and was opportunistic. I think he really wanted to escalate the war, but he needed a reason to escalate the war. And if he had not gotten a reason to escalate, then things might have gone differently. But he did get a reason to escalate, which was his first choice. And that was that in August of 1964, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy were part of a Navy group that was supporting a South Vietnamese army invasion of islands off the coast of North Vietnam, that is in the Gulf of Tonkin. It appears that in the murky daylight, fog-enshrouded daylight near these islands, that the patrolling North Vietnamese PT boats, which had been left over from World War II, may have fired a torpedo at one or both of these units. The sonar men picked up a whine that they thought sounded like a torpedo. They were not sure. They reported a potential torpedo to their superiors on board, who reported potential torpedo fire to their superiors in the Pentagon, who reported potential torpedo fire to Johnson, who said, "We've been fired upon," and went to Congress to ask for the right to commit troops and war material as he saw fit to prosecute this non-war in Vietnam. So he took over the war-making powers of Congress. There was never a declaration of war, but Congress did pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in August of '64, which gave Johnson the right to commit the U.S. to what we can call an executive war. We've seen this used since Johnson's administration as well. And so this is a precedent that Johnson set, in which Congress abrogates its responsibility to declare a war in favor of the administration acting on its own with congressional support, but not actually going to full-scale war, because war is never declared. Now, let me say this too, that the Pentagon Papers published in 1971 demonstrate that the Gulf of Tonkin incident had been blown out of proportion for political gain. In fact, most of the people on the Maddox and the Turner Joy came to believe that no torpedo had actually been fired at them. Certainly no torpedo ever struck. So we can probably say that the Tonkin incident was later demonstrated to be false. It was certainly demonstrated to be blown way out of proportion in order to drive Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. After Viet Cong and potentially North Vietnamese ground attacks on military bases in the South, particularly close to the North, then Johnson decided that air power could win this war and began a bombing campaign, full-scale bombing campaign of North Vietnam to cut off military supplies to the Viet Cong in February of 1965. This went on for 4 full years. We dropped more tonnage of ordnance on North Vietnam than the U.S. Air Corps had dropped in the entire Second World War. We sent ground troops into Vietnam in July of '65 after other attacks on other bases, and our strategy was to not only commit to ground troops, but also to pound North Vietnam into submission. We saturated bombing, or we used the tactic called saturation bombing, in which we dropped 1.5 million tons of bombs on North Vietnam. After we committed ground troops, we pursued the same strategy that the French had pursued, called fortified villages, in which we would drive the Viet Cong out of a village and then attempt to either fortify it or move people into concentrated areas that could be guarded, so it would deprive the Viet Cong in the countryside of support of the people. But then we implemented something new, a search and destroy mission strategy. This was our ground mission. We would send out small patrols to hunt for the Viet Cong in the rural countryside. Cities were much more difficult. This was supported by, beginning in 1965, with massive defoliation campaigns, particularly along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, using something that we continue to call Agent Orange. And let's look at a map here. Let me draw on this map. We bombed this area right around in here, saturation bombing of that area, near Hanoi and the port of Haiphong. We used Agent Orange to defoliate along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because the Vietnamese army was using the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went into Laos and Cambodia, in order to supply both North Vietnamese army regulars and the Viet Cong. And we use that fortified village and search and destroy capability. What did the North do? The North began full-scale warfare by sending troops and materiel through the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam, which they really had not done until about 1965. And they hoped that they could wear down the U.S. will to fight and allow war fatigue to set in. Now, remember, the Vietnamese had been at war for 25 years, almost continually. So they were way past the war fatigue stage. They also had much shorter supply lines, and they had an emotional connection to a homeland for which they believed they were fighting for its freedom and its reunification after being parted out by world superpowers that did not take their concepts of nationhood into consideration. Well, war fatigue truly did set in with the United States because, and this is a historical thing, we didn't know this at the time, though we suspected it, but looking back, historians and average folk can see that the beginning of the end began with the Chinese New Year, the Vietnamese New Year, in February of 1968 with the Tet Offensive. This began the denouement of the Americanization phase of the Vietnam War. And it's really the point at which we decided as a nation that we had had enough and it was time to get out. Now, it took a long time to leave after this, but Tet is regarded now as the point at which the war turned for the Americans. The U.S. government had exercised hegemony over its own news agencies, over American news agencies. Now, that's not to say it exercised control, but it did control the message. And news reports up to the time of Tet reflected the way that the commanding general, General Westmoreland, had wanted to view the war and had been selling the war. Remember, a lot of this was against a background of large protests against the war that we'll talk about later. Anyway, General William Westmoreland had done his accounting a particular way, and body counts were important, and we were proving, quote unquote, that we were winning the war. And the news media in the United States, for all of its vaunted liberalism, is really very much mainstream. And it's very middle class, and it really wants to tell a story the way it thinks that people want to hear the story. And it did that in Vietnam. Even though television brought the war into people's living rooms. And I remember sitting and watching television and seeing war reports, and these were not backline reports. These were reports by photojournalists and by television news crews of Americans getting wounded and killed. And I can still see it in my mind's eye, a number of news reports that I saw. And I was not quite a teenager at that time. Anyway, this was a living room war. We thought we were winning this war because we were fighting it the way we fought and reported fighting the Second World War. This was a reversion to the way we thought about the Second World War. And by killing lots and lots of the enemy, then we were winning, and that's the way it was reported. But we had, for all intents and purposes, stopped the Viet Cong in their tracks. They were not able, we thought, to mount any kind of effective resistance. But all of a sudden, in February of 1968, the North Vietnamese Army, and particularly the Viet Cong, made a coordinated attack on U.S. defenses in South Vietnam's cities in particular. One group of Viet Cong even seized the grounds of the U.S. Embassy for a little while before being killed by guards in the embassy. Westmoreland said this couldn't possibly happen. And so when it did happen, ultimately it broke the will of the U.S. to fight. That took a long time, but we can say that denouement occurred at Tet. Walter Cronkite was the most famous TV news anchor in the United States, far and away the most authoritative voice for news. And he went to investigate after Tet. He did a post-Tet tour and actually did investigative reporting and came back reporting that it didn't matter how many people we killed, these guys were never going to stop. fighting us. We were not going to be able to bomb them into submission or to kill enough of them to make the country a capitalist democratic country. And so, and like LBJ said, when you lose Walter Cronkite, you've lost the nation. His advisors, LBJ's advisors, voted against plumping the number of troops that Westmoreland requested immediately after Tet. They in fact said, no, there's no sense in pouring more troops in. And in March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson withdrew from the presidential campaign, and at the same time, he halted bombings and halted escalation in order to try to draw the North Vietnamese in particular to the conference table to see if this war could not be talked out rather than fought out. Okay, this is the Americanization of Vietnam. It escalated under Lyndon Johnson after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. We had a long-term bombing campaign from February of 65 into 68, 69 called Rolling Thunder. Our strategy was to saturate bomb the port of Haiphong and other important cities in the north, to fortify villages against the Viet Cong in the rural areas of the south, to search and destroy for Viet Cong in the south, and to massively defoliate along known trade routes like the Ho Chi Minh Trail. When we escalated, the North Vietnamese escalated, and though we were killing large numbers of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, those numbers, however, were inflated for public consumption in the U.S. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong in particular launched a Tet Offensive in 1968, and from that point on, the war was unwinnable for the United States. And on that sad note, let me thank you once again for your attention.